Okay. Now we're going to start our second set of our second session, second part. Now we're going to start with the Gemara. Until now, we've been discussing Pesach. We haven't yet gotten to the matzah. So now we finally get to the matzah. Amal Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Ein maftirin achar matzah afikoman. You can't eat not only after the Pesach, also after the matzah. Big question, does he mean in the time of the temple or not in the time of the temple? Now, we're going to see later, the Rashbam says he can't be talking about the time of the temple because in the time of the temple, if you couldn't eat after the Pesach, obviously you couldn't eat after the matzah because remember, the Pesach and the matzah and the maror were all eaten together. So he must be talking about post-temple time period. So he says you can't eat after the matzah afikoman. Now, what you're going to see in this next section is we're going to have what we call the mirror image sugya. We're going to have a version that says that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel this halacha. Then we're going to have the exact opposite. And everything that's brought now as a question or a support is going to be reversed in the second version. Okay, so that's going to be what's going to happen in this section. So now the Gemara is going to bring our Mishnah as a contradiction and say, wait a minute, Tanan, it says in our Mishnah, Ein maftirin achar Pesach afikoman. You can't eat after the Pesach afikoman. But it sounds like achar Pesach udelo, aval achar matzah maftirin. But it does seem to imply if you couldn't eat it after matzah, the Mishnah should have also said not after matzah. So therefore, they try to say that this must be wrong, what Shmuel said, right? Or how are you going to explain this? To which the Gemara answers, oh no, this Mishnah is what we call a lo mebaya structure. What's a lo mebaya structure? A lo mebaya structure, there's all different types of structures in the Gemara. We can say a Mishnah was written in a particular style. What's the style? The style is that the first the Gemara assumed if it says one thing, it means one thing and not anything else. But this is now going to explain the opposite. It's saying, no. It said one thing, which was actually a more obvious thing, but what it meant was not only this obvious thing, even something less obvious. Now, it's a bit of a strange structure to say that because you would think something less obvious should be the one that they should have mentioned. But that's the way a lo mebaya works. Lo mebaya means you don't need. Baya means need. We saw this already, this word before. Lo mebaya means you don't even need to say it here, right? Even more so there. So let's read what they do with this here. Okay, actually, I'll move down to where we have it in bigger here. Okay, so lo mebaya. Lo mebaya, and here I filled in the words for you so you can see the answers. Okay, see if you're right. Lo mebaya achar matzah de lo nafish ta'amayu. You don't even need to say it after matzah because matzah is not such a strong taste. But lachar Pesach de nafish tameh velo matzah avure late lamba. In other words, you might have thought that maybe, actually, now I'm just thinking, wait, needless to say, right. So you don't need to say it after matzah because matzah doesn't have such a strong taste. So therefore, you might have thought, 1 second, now I'm getting confused for one quick minute. Right, this is the issue. By matzah, you might have thought that the flavor is not so strong, and therefore you should be careful not to eat after matzah. But after Pesach, where the flavor is much stronger, it's actually, I explained the lo mebaya, I got confused for a minute. Let me just go back and say it. It's the opposite of what I said. That's why something Daniel did make sense as I was saying it. Let me say it better. You don't need to mention the obvious case. The matzah is the obvious case. My mistake. It's the structure of the Mishnah actually makes perfect sense. What it's saying is, okay, so rewind. Let me just recalibrate. The matzah is the one that doesn't even need to be stated. Now, the Mishnah stated specifically the case that's less obvious, and it would have been harder to come at on your own. You might have thought matzah doesn't have a lot of strong taste. So therefore, if you eat something after, right, therefore you might think, okay, we can eat something after it because, you can't eat anything after it because it's going to wash out whatever taste it had. It doesn't have such a strong flavor. But you might have thought that Pesach, which has a specifically strong flavor, that you need specifically to tell you that you, even though the flavor is so strong, you still can't eat anything after. Okay, so now that I'm confused, let me see if I actually wrote this right. So the simple reading is it's forbidden to eat after the Pesach. And nowadays we no longer have the sacrifice. Okay, so this is the beginning part, right? The simple reading is, you might have thought, this is how the Gemara started off. You can't eat after the Pesach, but now we don't have the sacrifice. So therefore the prohibition, the Mishnah is not relevant anymore. So therefore the Mishnah was brought, obviously, as a difficulty for Shmuel, but now the Gemara says that they want to teach you that even after Pesach, when the Pesach, I wrote it right here, I just made a spelling mistake, that even after eating the Pesach, where the flavor is so strong and doesn't leave so easily, it's forbidden to eat. Okay, you might have thought you didn't need to. And needless to say, after eating matzah, obviously, if the flavor is weak, of course, it's going to be forbidden to eat. Okay, that's clear. Okay, so therefore, don't think because the Mishnah said Pesach, it meant Pesach and not matzah. No, matzah was just obvious. So what does the Gemara do by doing this? They flip what we thought was a question for the Mishnah, and now it becomes strengthening Shmuel's opinion that you can't eat after matzah. Okay, that's the conclusion we now come to. Okay, I want to go back for a quick minute to Rabbeinu David, because Rabbeinu David says something interesting. Rabbeinu David tells us here that Masha Amarnu b'matzah she'em maftirin acharei Afikoman is because, and now he's saying, because remember I said that it has to be, we're talking about nowadays when there's no Pesach anymore. He says, Af bizman hazeh kavu et hadavar chova shelo ya'aklu mechavura lechavura. And as he sticks with this old the question is, the real question to think about is, why is, if you want to apply this to matzah, so think about it, does it apply to matzah? So let's go through our reasons that we had already. We had, because you might move from chabura to chabura. Is that relevant once there's no temple? No, right? We saw the reason that maybe you will go up on the roofs and sing with people and have this after party, right? Is that relevant after the times of the temple? Maybe, it's possible, right? Certainly if you say that we're worried you might forget to say Hallel, that would be a good reason to not eat more food after the Afikoman, right? You eat too much food and then you kind of forget, right? You get carried away by your meal. So depending on what your reason is will affect whether it's still true today. What Rabbeinu David tries to do is he says, no, it's irrelevant. Even if you say the reason was still, he says, but Mehera Yibaneh Mikdash, he says, the temple might be rebuilt any day. And even if it's only temple related, this halacha, we're still going to keep it, because what if the temple's rebuilt? And then we'll remember that last year we ate in two different places and they'll think that you can still eat. So therefore the reason might still be applicable even if it's only temple focused. So that's just an interesting aside. Okay. Now the Gemara continues and says, so we tried, but we started with Shmuel. He said, you can't eat after the matzah. Then we said, maybe we have a question from the Mishnah. We said, no, it's a Loma Baya structure. Don't worry about it. Now they try to bring a possible proof. And they say, let's try to bring a proof for Shmuel's position. Hasufganin, by the way, there's the first mention of sufganiyot in the Tannaitic sources. V'haduvshanim, v'askritin, these are all types of cakes. Adam mimalok chesomehem, you can fill up your stomach with them on Pesach. We're obviously talking about kosher, the Pesach cakes. Ubevad sheyochal kezayit matzah ba'achrona. Now, what does this sound like it's saying? As long as you end your meal with matzah. Doesn't it say that, right? Ba'achrona in, they infer. They infer from this source, and they say it sounds like only, right? As long as you ate matzah ba'achrona, but barishona lo. But not if you ate matzah in the beginning. Meaning that you have to end your meal with matzah and you can't eat after matzah. So this is a perfect proof for Shmuel. To which the Gemara says, oh no, we can explain this also as a Loma Baya structure. Just because it said ba'achrona didn't mean also not barishona. So they say, no, this is really coming to tell you something totally different. Not what you thought. This has to do with excessive eating. It's a Loma Baya structure. Loma Baya barishona deka'achel l'te'avon. Obviously, the first matzah, you eat b'te'avon, and you're obviously hungry at that point. So going back to the source, what does it say? Right? You can fill your stomach up with them as long as you eat a kazayit matzah b'achrona. Now, what they're trying to say is, you also have to eat a kazayit matzah in the beginning, which is, again, we're talking about the two different times you eat matzah at the Seder. The beginning, you're eating l'te'avon, you're obviously hungry. Aval b'achrona, but here it's coming to teach you that in the end, you might have thought you can't eat all this food in between because you'll end up excessively eating, and you'll end up eating that matzah on a terribly full stomach. you'll have gone overboard. And achila gasa is something they don't even think really counts as eating. So you might think that maybe you can't eat the cakes in that sense. So in that case, and they say, no, kamash malan, you can still eat that and still eat your matzah, okay? And therefore, they're saying, again, it's a lo mabaya structure, and this basically doesn't, this is again a tosefta, by the way, and it doesn't, the source that we just saw, this sufkanim v'aduv shani, and it doesn't create an issue. Okay. Now we're going to have the mirror image. So if you got that, you'll get this, because now we're just going to go everything, it's like rewind and do it a different way. Marzutra matnehachi, he says, this is his version that he had. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. We have someone else passing it down, but in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel. Maftirin achar hamatzah afikoman. You can eat after matzah, no problem. Okay, we don't do this, but that's what he said. And then we have Nema Misayele. Oh, let's bring this source to prove. What are we going to bring to prove it? Our Mishnah, because just as our Mishnah was a contradiction to the opposite, right? Now that we're saying it's the reverse, we're going to bring the Mishnah as a proof. Nema Misayele, em maftirin achar hapesach afikoman, achar hapesach delo, aval achar matzah maftirin. There's your perfect proof. Our Mishnah said only Pesach, not matzah. So then the Gemara says, oh no, it's lo mebaya kamar, lo mebaya achar matzah, obviously matzah. Delo nafish tame, because matzah's strong, taste isn't so strong. Aval achar Pesach emalo, but you might have thought Pesach no, and that's why kamashman, the Mishnah needs to specifically tell you Pesach. So we tried to bring the Mishnah now as a proof. We reject the proof. Now they say meitive. Now they say, wait, let's bring this other source as a contradiction. Hasufkinin, ba'aduv shanin, ba'aspritin, adamim alei kresomehem. Someone can fill themselves up. Ubevad sheyochal kazayat matzah b'achrona. So b'achrona im barishona lo, which seems to contradict because it seems to say you can't eat after having the matzah. So then they say again, oh no, it's lo mebaya kamar, lo mebaya barishona deka'achel leteavon. Right there, you're eating because you're eating it with an appetite, and then, but also, you might have thought not, kamash malan, that you can. Okay, so we don't mind that you're eating this, even though you might have a kind of full stomach. Okay, so that was the mirror image of the sugya. So here's, again, this is a good chart that just shows you how we took something. One said you can't eat after matzah. One version was you can eat after matzah. You know, each different versions of which Shmuel said. Do we bring it as difficulty, a strength, of difficulty, right? And then we just do the reverse. Okay. Now, what I want to get now is to the whole idea about what the purposes of our matzah is that we eat at the end of the Seder. So the Rashbam says, and this connects back with what we learned last time about Hillel. Remember the Hillel sandwich? So he says, right, so we have the matzah in the beginning. We said, that's the real mitzvah. Then we said, oh, well, maybe the sandwich is the real mitzvah because that's remembering how it was in temple times. Comes the Rashbam and he says, forget Hillel. He says, this is the matzah. That's zecher lematzah hanechelet im pesach b'kricha. This is the Hillel sandwich, but not as this, right? This is the one that's remembering what happened in the temple. It's not the Hillel sandwich. It's just, this is the one. V'zohi matzah b'tzuah she'anu ochlim ba'achrona. This is the one we eat at the end. L'shem, and here's a big word, chova. The whole question is, I don't know if you've ever wondered why we're eating more matzah. We ate a lot of matzah. He says this is obligatory. You have to wonder what the Rashbam thinks you're eating the matzah in the beginning for is, right? Maybe you want to eat the matzah in the beginning, but the real idea is, remember, how did we start? The Pesach was eaten ala sova. The Pesach was the last thing you ate. So if you want to remember the matzah that was eaten with the Pesach, it should be at the end of your meal. The problem is that we're having right? Probably, what would he say? What's the reason for the matzah in the beginning of the meal? Lechem Mishnah, right? Any meal, you have a holiday meal, you do it on bread or on matzah. But that's not the mitzvah, right? This is radical. This is so different from what we've always thought. The real matzah is the end. And that's why, if we're doing it zecher lePesach, it's obvious then that that's why we don't eat after. The Rosh says, wait a minute. This matzah ain't na l'shem chova. He has a different approach. He says, clearly this is not obligatory, this Afikoman. But ochlim ota zecher lePesach, as it was eaten ala sova at the end, and therefore, right, we treat it the same, but not because it's an obligation, right? He totally disagrees with the Rashbam and says, this isn't your main mitzvah of matzah. Your main mitzvah of matzah is when you said the bracha, ala chilat matzah. You know, what could be more than that? This is just a nice remembrance, kind of like we have the sandwich and the approach to say that the sandwich was just a way of remembering. This is also just a way of remembering. And then if you look in the Haggadah, the Pesach of the Ritva, he says, after this, you eat your meal. Before they bench, here's a different reason. It's not to remember the mikdash. It's not to remember, right, what was then, whether we view it as obligatory or optional. But according to him, it's so that you keep the taste of the matzah in your mouth. Okay, it's similar to the temple, but it's not to remember the temple. It's just saying the matzah is the main mitzvah nowadays. We don't have the Pesach. The main thing left is the matzah. We'll see why not maror. Okay, we'll get to that next week. Difference between matzah and maror, which we kind of already touched somewhat before, but we'll get more to it next week. And he says, because of that, it's just, right, it's just a nice thing to do, right, to kind of end your meal with the taste. And what's interesting about this is the question, the big nafkamina, as we say, what's the relevance la halacha between all this, is how do we do, if you say it's just a nice thing to do, then you could eat a little bit of matzah and fulfill your obligation. If not, then you have to eat a kazayit, right? And some people even say 2 kazayits, because if you're fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah, some people are stringent and they say you have to eat 2 kazayits. So that's what the Maharil says. He says you have to eat actually 2 zaitim, okay, which is a lot, okay. And the handmade shmur matzahs, I think it's like between a half and between a third and a half is a kazayit. So you have to eat matzah according to him. The Sefer Achinuch says kol echad ochel me'at matzah zecher lePesach. It's just a way to remember the Pesach. Eat a little bit of matzah. Okay, so there you have some thoughts about the Korban Pesach and the Afikoman and how, in other words, if you're wondering, all those people who've been learning daf, and we spent so much time talking about the Korban Pesach, what we have left of the Korban Pesach at our meal. So now you've learned that we have something that reminds us of the sacrifice that they used to do. I want to just point out a few methodological points of things we did today. Okay, so we had this word that came from some other language, likely the Greek. And because of that, the rabbis grappled with what exactly does this word mean? We saw the benefit of having someone like Lieberman, who was a real academic, who had knowledge of the Greek language and could use that to try to shed some light on understanding our sugyas. So there's, yes, it's important to look at commentaries, but it's also important to use academic, right? Rav Steinsaltz was known for doing this, for really trying to, when it came to botany and all sorts of other things, to use the academic, and all the experts. He would go to all the experts that there were on those topics. So that's one. We saw a Yerushalmi and how the commentaries on the Yerushalmi are often influenced by the Bavli, and that affects how they explain the Yerushalmi, which, as I said, is a good intro to Masechet Shkalim that we're going to start. We saw, let's see, some other things. We saw about this concept of Afikoman. What is it, right? We took something that we just take as obvious, but we never really think about where does this come from? What is it? And obviously the matzah came to be called Afikoman, which, is also just interesting. I just wrote myself some notes. I'm just glancing at them. Right. We saw that. And then the main issue that we saw in the first half was this idea about 3 different opinions, but are they really 3? Or are they only 2? Are things that are similar really different? Are things that are different really similar? Right. And that was a whole issue with different interpretations and how to understand them. So with that, we're going to end for today. And now we'll open up for questions.